Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. We have four speakers that we will hear from today. We have Myron Roth, who is the Director of Climate Risk Management. He is with the Climate Action Secretariat, Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. We have also Ken Valines, he is the Senior Manager at Coastal Community Credit Union, and Yvonne Jones, who is a insurance advisor with Coastal Community Credit Union. And we have Cheryl McClay, who is the Regional Manager for Vancouver Island Coastal Region and Rural Development Unit with the Ministry of Jobs, Economic Development, and Innovation. Excellent. So we're going to first start our talk with Myron, and he's going to talk about provincial planning to mitigate risk. And so he will speak to what are the goals of the Climate Action Secretariat and why they were established, how you are addressing mitigation and how you are addressing adaptation as a ministry, and then what are some of the highlights of the BC's Climate Risk and Reduction Plan. We have 20 minutes for our entire session, so we're going to allow about 6 minutes per group to be able to speak. So we'll start with Myron.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to try and cover those points as best as I can, although I am going to confess I found out about this kind of at the last minute. So what I would like to do is just give a bit of an overview of what I'm going to say we are doing for climate risk, preparedness and basically to deal with climate risk. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at a very high level. And I'm going to work my way down to specifics, and then I'll be able to answer some questions. So I would start by saying the province has been involved in climate change mitigation and adaptation for many, many years. And when I say mitigation and adaptation, just to clarify, mitigation is what we do to reduce greenhouse gases, and adaptation is how we respond to changes in the environment. Both are very important because, of course, it all starts with GHG gases. But even if we get to net zero, it may not even be enough, and we may have to adapt to changing environment around us. So a lot of this work goes all the way back to 2018 Auditor General's report, BC Flood and Wildfire Review, which all led to the 2019 Preliminary Risk Assessment, the Clean BC Roadmap to 2023, the Climate Preparedness and Adaptation Strategy, and the BC Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Action Plan. And all those documents are available online. So we also have specific legislation addressing climate change, including the Climate Change Accountability Act, and the very new, which was just promulgated and came into law this year, the Emergency and Disaster Management Act, which takes a proactive approach and includes all 4 phases of the Sendai framework that was adopted by BC in 2018. I'll talk a bit about that later. And to get a sense of the current activities and progress on how BC is addressing climate change and progress made, I would suggest you have a look or Google the 2023 Climate Change Accountability Report. And that report's the 4th one since that requirement to publish these reports was brought in under the Climate Change Accountability Act. So a key feature of the report is GHG emissions, which has been a huge focus of the province. And this, the current report notes that in 2021, BC's per capita emissions were down 21% from 2007, but and down 9% from 2018, but unfortunately up 1% from 2020. So a big change up front, but then to try and get more change gets harder and harder and harder. Other highlights of interest to people on the call are, BC continues its high uptake of zero-emission vehicles in 2022. They accounted for 18% of all new light-duty vehicle sales. The Go Electric EV charger rebates funded charging stations for 2,318 homes. And 547 multi-unit residential buildings and 249 workplaces. So there's more and more chargers. You can charge for these cars. They also provided 13,000 and 45 residential retrofit rebates in 22-23, including 6,000 incentives for heat pumps, 84% more than what happened in 21-22. And as we know, heat pumps are probably the most efficient way to try and heat and cool your home compared to what we are using right now. And that was all supplied through the Clean BC Better Homes and Better Buildings programs. Bombing along here, a couple other ones. Another one of interest, and there's lots more than this if you go through the report, removing 471 tons of debris in 2022 through the Clean Coast, Clean Waters Initiative Fund, bringing the total tons of debris removed by the program to over 1,500. So that's kind of what's reported in that report. A couple other noteworthy things are, if you know that we released the budget not too long ago, budget 2024. If you go through that document, you'll see that there's significant investments being made in climate resiliency, and that includes 252 million over 4 years to bolster the province's capacity to prepare for and respond to future climate emergencies. So these include several things. But of interest is 10 million to raise the dam height and increase water storage to improve the water flow of St. Mary Lake on Salt Spring Island. And then there's some other things like 18 million to support year-round delivery of government response and recovery programs, such as regional, provincial operation centers, and better coordinating vital communications that alert residents to imminent hazards and evacuation orders. 234 million over 2 years for priority infrastructure projects, programming to decrease flood risks and improve management of water resources, and those sort of things. What else was in there? And in 2023, ministries received additional funding for specific projects and additional funding for the Community Emergency Preparedness Fund through Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. And one of the things that was included in all that was a heat response framework to expanded stream flow and climate monitoring networks, improved flood preparedness and floodplain mapping, and actions to increase climate resilience to the health sector.
So can I ask a question in regards to that,
Sure.
Myron? What would be, if from a community perspective, what would people be able to expect from that report or those types of initiatives? How as a community could they actually integrate into that?
Well, in the case of things like, to try and improve the water storage capacity on Salt Spring Island, it usually is local government that applies for those funds. So the community would then benefit because it would provide a more secure and a sustained water supply for that community, right?
Okay,
So if communities have various projects that they want to come to government with, then they have to prioritize those projects, come to the government, and then they apply for funding. And it would take a long time to go through the various projects that have been funded for various communities. When I was going through it, I was just looking for something that I thought would be of keen interest to the crowd on the call.
Okay, nope, that sounds fine. So next we're going to move on to Ken Valines, and he's the Senior Manager of Coastal Community Credit Union, as well as Yvonne Jones, who is a insurance advisor for the credit union. And we'd like to ask them some questions in regards to what business interruption services are provided through insurance and through a credit union. And then to Yvonne, what has been her experience with clients with these types of protections? And what is a good experience that you've had with clients, and how do you see that people could be more prepared? So we'll start with Ken about, what are the services that can be provided? And then from an experience perspective, Yvonne, what have you seen where things have gone well with clients and where things could have been better and how they could have been better prepared?
Okay, so what services in particular for business interruption? Actually, it really does go to a wide variety of all sorts of businesses and what we can offer to them. So we'll take a step back. So what is business interruption? So basically, business interruption insurance is insurance that you get to protect you when you have an insured peril that will pay the revenue that you would have received had your business still been opened. For instance, you have a fire in the building, there's a fire, you have to shut down your business for 6 months. and you don't have any revenue coming in. Business interruption will pay you the revenue that you would have received while your business is shut down. So it actually does provide you with a way to continue as a business without having to try to come up with that revenue while your business is shut down. And in business interruption, we have there's a saying that goes, coverage follows form. So what that means is, what triggers the business interruption? So if you have insurance, you want to make sure that you have the proper insurance so that you can trigger that business interruption. For instance, if there's an earthquake and you have an earthquake, but you want to make sure that you have earthquake insurance so that the business interruption will be triggered in the case that your business is shut down. That actually provides on a wide variety, like I said. So you can be a retail, you can be office. There are some times where there might be some digital and cyber consequences that you will have coverage for business interruption.
Excellent. Sounds great.
Yeah.
So Yvonne, in your experience when you're dealing with clients, what have you found has been a great experience with a client, and then where maybe things could be improved or they could have had more information? What do you think is key steps for people to understand when they're looking at preparing for for some form of an insurance claim? So how do you prepare in advance? And then what can make things easier for people to be prepared when they come to see you?
Sorry, just realized I was muted there. I was just going to say, I think it's so important for small business owners to make sure that they're doing like a proper business plan when they're opening up a business, and they're doing some contingency planning. So they're thinking about worst case scenarios, thinking about things that are outside of their control. What could happen and how is that going to affect you? So like Ken said, if there was a fire or if there was flooding and there was damages to your business and you couldn't stay open, are you the main breadwinner for your family? Do they rely on your income? Do you have loans that will continue even when that income's not coming in anymore, that will still need to get paid? Will you need financial relief during that time? So just really like doing the contingency planning, thinking about worst case scenarios, putting a proper business plan in place, I think are all really key steps when you're opening a business. As far as my experience, I have had some clients that have had some devastating losses, even just in the last couple of years. When you're in a multi-tenanted building, for instance, where there's several other tenants, you're kind of at the mercy of everyone else in the building to make sure they're doing their due diligence as well. Like I had a client with a small business, and there was also a restaurant in the building where a fire started and the entire building burnt to the ground. And unfortunately, my clients, she lost everything. Luckily, she did have the business interruption coverage in place. So that was some peace of mind that she would still have that revenue coming in until she figured out what she was doing, whether that was going to be reopening again or paying the expenses to move her to another location temporarily. So it does provide you with some relief during a very stressful time.
Okay. And in your experience, we've had a lot of incidences happen. We've had wildfires, we have had road closures, we have had COVID, a number of things. In your experience, what are the number of businesses that are successfully able to be able to receive the benefits? Where do you see maybe that there has been a shortfall in either their ability to understand their insurance policy or their ability to be able to provide documentation that you require?
I can't really speak to the documentation piece because that is more with our claims specialists. So I'm more front forward facing with the clients, and I'm helping them with the claims process and maybe speaking with the claims adjuster on their behalf, and then relaying information to the clients on what's needed. I'd say one of the biggest things that, as far as business interruption coverage goes, that you'll want to be keeping track of is your revenue stream. So they would want to see what your income looked like for the past 12 months on a month-to-month basis so that they could determine what they're going to be paying you That gives them a very clear idea as to what your revenue has been for the last year and what it was expected to be for the next 12 months. And then they can determine what they're going to pay you out. So lots of financial information would be needed for business interruption losses.
So when looking at financial information, on average, how many years prior financial information do you require for insurances? Is it 3 years of financial statements? Is it income tax records? What are the types of things that people should have in advance, kind of prepared for when these situations happen?
I'd say they'd be looking for like the 12 months prior leading up to the claim.
Okay.
And when you're planning for so when we put business interruption coverage in place for a client on their business package, the kinds of conversations we're having with them are, what kind of growth are you anticipating for the next 12 months? Because that's the limit of insurance that we want to put in place for your business interruption, is what you're expecting for the future. And then another big piece of the conversation as well is, how long do you think it would take to rebuild after a loss? Sometimes 12 months business interruption coverage isn't enough. Sometimes people need 24 months. Sometimes people need 36 months. So it just depends. Everybody's insurance situation is unique. Some people own the buildings that they're operating out of and may require longer periods of time. So it's really just so individualized. And it's just really important to be having conversations with your insurance broker about those things.
Okay, sounds good. So thank you for that. Next, we're going to move to Cheryl McClay, who is the regional manager for Vancouver Island Coastal Regional and Rural Development Unit with the Ministry of Jobs, Economic Development, and Innovation. And Cheryl, we'd like you to give us a bit of your learnings from the 2023 climate change disruptions that happened on Port Alberni Highway 4 and what you saw as areas that need improvement, et cetera, in collaboration.
Great. Thanks, Jolene. And I'm just going to speak today about my experience and my observations, which primarily relate to more of the recovery side, but I will share some of my learnings. Our ministry is not involved in response, and there's a difference between response and recovery. But in terms of the spirit of preparedness, I welcome this opportunity to chat with folks and appreciate the highlights related to business interruption insurance, because a lot of folks didn't have that on the West Coast, and I think it's great for folks to be considering. In terms of the West Coast, as folks know, the road was, there was a forced closure for 2 weeks when there was the wildfire, and then the rocks came down. And then there were ongoing disruptions due to rock scaling and safety issues that led to ongoing disruptions through the peak summer months in terms of access to Port Alberni and the West Coast. A number of our businesses, of course, during the pandemic, we all pivoted, and a lot of businesses went to e-commerce. When a road is closed and your transportation and logistics are impacted, businesses that had moved to online and e-commerce sales, we're almost seeing an immediate 30% reduction overnight in terms of that. So thinking collaboratively about logistics and how we're moving goods and services on and off our rural islands for small businesses is really important. A number of visitors, of course, couldn't make it to the West Coast. The hotels were losing, some of them $12,000 to $15,000 a day. Staff had been hired at peak levels because they were moving into the peak summer season. There's also a housing crisis on the West Coast, which is familiar to many of you here with on the islands, on the rural islands. What the employers did because of that was continue to pay their staff, even though nobody was there. And one of the tools that we needed to get to people earlier was the Service Canada work sharing agreements. And I wanted to highlight that today as a tool for folks. And if you're not familiar with it, I wasn't. Service Canada, if can provide a work share, so they can partially pay for folks if there's a decrease in normal business activity that is beyond the control of the employer. So I would really encourage all of you who have networks that can reach private sector businesses, if there is that kind of interruption and folks are keeping their good staff and keeping them on board, to look into those kinds of programs. There were big closures. There were things like there was food at the hotels that weren't being used because they again were at their peak. You know, what do you start doing with that fresh food that was now starting to rot in fridges? Smaller employers were losing revenues. One of the e-bike rental companies, you know, monthly revenues dropped from 6,000 to 1,000. On the West Coast, they use all that time to get their revenue for the year, as many folks do on the tourism side. Ongoing concerns relate to international travelers taking the entire West Coast and Port Alberni region out of their travel itineraries for upcoming years because of risks, whether real or perceived, and ongoing anxiety related to access and if the road would close down again. Also, my observation was the economic response ecosystem was very well organized. Those are volunteer firefighters, the first responders, local governments, Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness, Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure in that perspective. What wasn't as well organized, in my opinion, was the economic development ecosystem. All of the service providers that many of you are connected with on the recovery side, whether it was and I think it was just because it was the first time we've had that kind of impact on one of our islands in a long time. And I think it's really important, if you don't know who your emergency operations center person is. We didn't have someone in Port Alberni that served from the business community on the emergency operations center. And so as a result, there was a bit of a lack of communication there that was going on. And so one of the recommendations coming out of that was to have, in this case, the Chamber of Commerce serve on the Emergency Operations Center moving forward, potentially under logistics, to make sure the voice of business was getting addressed through that process. Because really our responders are looking at life and limb impacts. And there is that kind of transition between response and recovery. And we just felt that that could really help things. When the incident happened on the actual road, folks turned around and visitors went to their visitor centers. So you need to see if your visitor centers know where to get information in terms of finding fact-based information on, you know, what's happening with the emergency and that kind of thing. In terms of recovery, Community Futures has played a role with business advisors getting in there, working with, and that's how now we're second summer. Community Futures is still meeting with folks about impacts. It doesn't go away overnight. These are significant impacts that impacted folks' bottom line. And as the province and others may be moving on to the next emergency that's right in front of us, getting concerned about the next fire season, there's still those impacts that you need to think about how together you can work together. Things like people weren't insured to be on the alternative routes or the forestry roads. Pet food couldn't get into the community. The pharmacies didn't have drugs coming in. I wasn't quite alive to the fact, just for especially diabetics and insulin, how we really need those supply lines to be moving. So just kind of that, what businesses are critical on your islands to keep open, how can you support them if there are those kind of impacts. Also knowing kind of what resources are around you is one of the lessons learned. The Parksville Chamber operates Deliver Vancouver Island. And there was a furniture store that had to turn away all of their goods. Had they known about Delvey, which is a micro fulfillment center like a mini Amazon, with a warehouse and a business delivery service for small businesses. They're a micro fulfillment center. They take goods from small businesses, orders, and send them out to everybody on the island. They had said, call us. Like as soon as they knew something was happening, chamber to chamber gave a phone call, said moving forward, have them come, we'll store their stuff for free. And now the chambers are meeting collectively, the neighbors, meaning the chambers within the Alberni-Clayoquot region and the neighbors within the regional district of Nanaimo, forming a Mid-Island Chamber Alliance to talk about what if this happens next time. How are we going to improve this? How are we going to prepare our businesses more? How are we going to make sure that they have business interruption insurance, that they videotape the contents of their business, that they've done all of those things that they need to do to prepare for the next emergency, because folks weren't prepared. And if you have a devastating situation like Linton, where 90% of your business is burned down, I think this was it was a wake-up call for me in this role, of knowing that there were certain gaps that together, and that's kind of led to the conversation with RIEP related to, how can we formalize some of these networks, make sure people connected. Do folks have cell phone numbers? Do folks know? And I think one of the strengths that I saw was because the emergency response network was so connected, you know, and it was people that made the difference. It was Karen from the Alberni Clackarat Regional District phoning Mike at the Port Authority saying, if we don't have fuel and food coming in tomorrow, who do you know? C-SPAN barges, like, how are we getting food in? And then on the flip side of that, if there was materials moving out from a logistics perspective, how could we have been moving goods and services out on those boats, or the airplanes that were coming, that were still luckily coming in and out of the community? And we didn't have a chance to really unlock that in terms of, if you did have those going, how would you get services? Would it be through a lottery system? Would it be major employers first because they have the largest perceived impact on community? You know, how do you kind of get to some of those? So those were some of the, I have 4 pages of lessons learned, Jolene. But that was just some of the highlights. And I think that, you know, folks didn't have their business continuity plans done. They didn't have, you know, and you don't want to tell folks that after the case or when you're in the middle of a devastating financial situation.
And I think part of that is that, I mean, this is a short conversation for a much larger conversation that needs to be had between organizations, between people, between businesses, communities. So what I would like to do is open the floor up to some questions. Do people have questions that they want to ask of Cheryl, of Yvonne, of Ken, of...
I have a question in the chat, Jolene, if I could
Sure.
read that to you.
Yes.
Is there any coordination or communication between insurance providers and emergency management and climate readiness ministry to ensure policies meet needs during large disasters? So it's about coordination between the insurance agencies and the various government bodies.
Maybe Myron can
Myron?
speak. Myron.
Well, what I was going to say was I was thinking about that. I would say that at the moment right now, there isn't, but I could be wrong, so don't quote me on it, although someone probably will. But I do know that as part of the disaster and climate risk and resilience assessment, I was going to talk about it a bit, but I went a little bit too long there. But the bottom line is that risk assessment is looking at 6 hazards and 6 value areas. And one of the value areas is the economy. And as part of the economy working group, there is a bit of a discussion about how insurance factors into this. So it's kind of like an ongoing discussion. And I think we're going to talk about it more. And I know that folks that are sitting around those tables realize that unless we support the insurance sector to get more involved ahead of the game, they can't get involved afterwards, kind of thing. And so that's about as much as I can say about it from that perspective.
Ken? You're on mute. You're on mute.
There.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. And I can add the same thing. I know that some of our execs and CEOs in the insurance industry are having some ongoing conversations because we do realize how important it is, particularly in light of some of the fires that happened last year, particularly out there in the Okanagan Valley in that area where there was some devastating losses that happened there. So it is something that I know we are the insurance industry is initiating conversations as well.
Excellent.
I think there's some gaps there though.
Yeah.
Jolene. So I think collectively, if there's any opportunities to engage in those discussions and that kind of thing, I know on the West Coast, and Yvonne or Ken, jump in if you could, not my area of expertise, but I think, you know, because there was an emergency declared, folks were away from the disaster by so many kilometers, they weren't able to trigger some of those. I don't know if that's accurate.
Sorry, what do you mean by trigger? Like
they couldn't access their business interruption insurance because there wasn't an emergency declared, and the emergency on the West Coast wasn't physically close to them. So I don't know if there's anything that you could speak to, if there's nuances about that.
Yeah, there are some nuances about that because, I mentioned it a little earlier, is often coverage follows form. So there does need to be a trigger sometimes. And I think it's a good conversation to have about when is an emergency declared and how can that affect the insurance? Because typically, if something is emergency declared, it can have an impact, and actually your insurance will respond. But when there's not one, or when you're out of that area, then it does become a little more difficult. I think that's a good conversation to have, and something that we need to maybe have some discussions with people that are in government about how can we close that gap? Because I agree with you.
Mhm.
I'm just going to comment. A good example of that is you look what happened in the past between the atmospheric river that happened in the Sumas Plain, where an emergency was declared, and like farmers, for example, could access, and other folks could access coverage. But during the heat dome that occurred, that caused a lot of damage and suffering, but it wasn't declared an emergency. And so it was very difficult to get coverage for those for the exact reason that Ken was talking about.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think just making sure that folks are chatting with their insurance providers is so critical. I think when I was reading the Linton results, 40% of folks didn't have insurance at all.
Yeah.
Of the 90% of businesses that burnt to the ground. So
that's right. I
it's
agree. It's really
devastating.
important. It's really important to have those early conversations. And one of the things that we've had, I've been in insurance for a long time. One of those conversations we have is when people talk about they never think it's going to happen to them. So it's one of those things where you really want to try to help prepare them and really understand that likely it's not going to happen to you, but if it does happen to you, then you need to be prepared. I think it's one of those things where we have to get early awareness out to people to understand the importance of it. Now, you correct me, I might be wrong, but my understanding is sometimes even with some of the emergency relief that's paid out, government looks on and sees if they actually had coverage in place. And it doesn't mean they're not going to help them, but it actually means that they might go down lower in the list in response times. Is that correct? Or like I've heard this said before about emergency response and about people who decided not to insure and they're not maybe on the top of the priority list.
I'm afraid I don't have enough knowledge to comment on that.
So
Sorry.
one of the questions that's
Sorry.
come in the chat is how much warning we're talking about there's looking like another heat dome coming this summer. There's trends towards that. How is that working within the world of insurance and the Ministry of Environment? Are you looking at trends, and what does this mean for people, and what should they be preparing for and doing?
Oh, you're on mute, Myron.
Nope.
So I'm just trying to process the question. Can you?
Well, in the news, etc., it's being said that we're looking at a hotter summer than normal, a heat dome where we've had less rainfall than normal, and so from an when you look at insurance is about risk. And so what is the risk factors that are happening with insurance companies, and what are they looking at? And then from an Ministry of Environment perspective, what are your thoughts about what are happening and how should people be preparing?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't really know the answer to that to give an informed response. I do know that a lot of models are being used and developed for climate change. And I know that, for example, I think there was some models out there that could have predicted the atmospheric river, but for some reason they weren't used. I don't know. So I think that moving forward, they would like to have predictive models, but what the link is between what the models say and getting insurance is, I just don't know. I don't think people have got there yet. They're still trying to, get various pieces of the puzzle in place. But I know that the insurance piece will somehow get factored into the risk assessment. What becomes of it is something different.
Okay,
Exactly.
Sounds
exactly.
good.
You have to wrap it up.
So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap up and we're going to transition to a bit of a break, and then we'll start with the second roundtable. Thank you.